Cześć, hello, witam, and welcome to Pierogi to Prayer, the official podcast of St. Joseph's Polish Apostolate of the Diocese of Camden, coming to you from our historic home at 1010 Liberty Street in Camden, New Jersey, the heart of South Jersey's Polonia for over 130 years. I am your host, Michael Matalevich. Chances are that if you were asked to identify an ethnicity that celebrates its heritage in March, your answer would probably be the Irish. For our co-immigrants, their patron saint of Patrick is popularly commemorated with his feast day on March the 17th and with the wearing of the green from head to toe. This day has taken on a universal appeal, embodied in the saying, "Everyone is Irish on St. Patrick's Day." The festive atmosphere surrounding this day is enjoyed in pubs and restaurants that feature Irish spirits and traditional music, combined with parades and public festivities taking place across the country. In Chicago, this has even included the famous dyeing of the Chicago River, the green color of the Emerald Isle. However, in the turn of the 20th century, these types of public celebrations of the Irish people who had immigrated in the mid-1800s and were thus well established would often clash with newer immigrant groups from Southern and Eastern Europe. Tensions over employment and neighborhood territory meant that the atmosphere surrounding St. Patrick's Day wasn't always so jovial. In some communities, this public expression of pride on March the 17th led to the establishment of a competing celebration in honor of St. Joseph's Day, occurring 2 days later on March the 19th by Italian and Polish immigrants. These groups, united in the face of discrimination and suspicion towards their strange customs from earlier ethnicities, showed their pride by wearing red instead of green and honoring this saint who features prominently in both of their cultures and is revered in the Universal Church for his part in the early life of Christ. Although Polish and Irish relations are thankfully no longer so acrimonious, we nonetheless decided to offer a special podcast episode this month in honor of St. Joseph, in keeping with his tradition, but mostly due to his historical association with March and Polish pride, and more importantly, due to his patronage of the apostolate in our parish for over 130 years. It also seemed a fitting tribute that since we are so defined by the history of our community in South Camden, that we also devote the episode to the discussion of this parish history in general with those who know it so well. I was pleased to sit down with Dot and Henry Szychulski, lifelong members of St. Joseph's Polish, for an extended take on the stories of our local Polish community and that of our stunningly beautiful church. Henry and Dot have been among the greatest champions of preserving the history and culture of our historic home, and I think you'll agree that their passion and love for St. Joe's certainly comes through in our discussion. As probably the most active organization within our apostolate, the St. Joseph History Society, of which Henry serves as president, has been instrumental in raising awareness of our treasured buildings and artifacts, as well as chronicling the rich history of the neighborhood and culture that exists in the southern New Jersey Polish community. Our conversation, however, was not just a chronological timeline of events and people associated with our historic properties, but took on a deeply reflective tone as well. As the couple shared the many happy memories of their childhood and adult lives growing up in Camden, we were able to explore the impact and relevance that St. Joe's had in its past, but also on its present and in its future. I hope you will agree that our talk was a worthy way to honor this great saint. So Dot and Henry, thank you so very much for being on Pierogi to Prayer.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Michael.
Of course. So I guess we start talking just a little bit about yourselves. How long have you been associated with the parish, and kind of just what your overall association is with St. Joe's Polish Apostolate?
I was born into the parish. My father was a parishioner. My mother was actually a parishioner at Immaculate Conception, but when they married, they became part of St. Joe's. I've been part of the parish most of that time. I became part of the choir when I was 9, and then I wasn't there for several years when I lived elsewhere, and then I came back in the early part of the century.
And my parents came here after the Second World War. They immigrated to Camden and became parishioners here. I was baptized at St. Joseph's and actually been a lifelong parishioner.
And I guess I know that you've received all of your sacraments because I was at your wedding
Yes.
a couple of years ago too.
Yeah.
Which was really nice. And since then, since the parish was merged with the cathedral parish and we have the St. Joseph Apostolate, you've been active in other ways.
Yes. Part of that was, of course, the St. Joseph History Society. We've been part of the merger process.
I'm the facilitator for the apostolate.
And I run the History Society.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about the History Society.
Well, we kind of came into effect around 2006 when the merger talks were going on, and there was, I guess, a realization that we might not have a parish anymore. So we thought it was important to be able to preserve the history of what went on here. The parish goes back to 1892, and it was primarily a Polish ethnic parish. And it was also a time that we realized that ethnic parishes were starting to disappear. So we wanted to be able to at least preserve the experiences and the culture that came out of that.
And that's why I thought it was important to start recording the choir music, because we didn't want to lose it.
Right, yeah. I mean, the St. Joe's choir, well, the St. Lucia's choir had a really long history,
Yes.
which we can certainly talk about, and kind of some wonderful musical repertoire. So, yeah, that was important. And then it was also, you started recording elderly parishioners as well, right?
We did the oral history program prior to the History Society.
We did record some of the parishioners, some of their memories.
That's one of the things that I've noticed about St. Joe's, having been associated with other parishes, is that there was so much history that we actually still had. A lot of places haven't necessarily kept it around, which was really a treasure. And so part of the mission of the History Society, or the activities of the History Society, has been giving these monthly tours that are done seasonally. And it's always on the first Saturday of the month.
Yes,
right?
From October, second Saturday.
Second Saturday of the month.
Yeah, so it's on the second Saturday of the month, October, November, December, and January.
Mm-hmm. And having been part of these tours myself and been to them, so I know that you're usually the one who welcomes the group that comes. And and we have the other docents that kind of show people around and give them this tour, but usually give this kind of brief introduction on the history of St. Joe's. And since today's episode is to talk about St. Joe's history, would you mind just kind of giving us a little bit of a rundown?
Sure. Well, we really start going back to the 1870s and the 1880s when Polish immigrants started to arrive in the city of Camden. They were spread out throughout the city. And by the 1880s, the area where St. Joe's is located, then known as Liberty Park and later as Whitman Park, was starting to be developed as the city started to expand away from its core, away from the Delaware River and further south. So by 1891, a group of these Polish immigrants began the St. Joseph Society with the goal of starting a Polish parish. They were, at the time, many of the Polish people were going across the river to St. Stanislaus. A number of them were going to St. Peter and Paul's, which at that time was a German ethnic parish, but many of the Polish people did speak German. So in 1892, we were then part of the Trenton Diocese, and they received permission to start their own parish, and they had Mass at a rented hall near Kane and Broadway. And by 1895, we received the first full-time pastor, Father Michael Boronsky, who acquired the property that the original church was built on, along with the surrounding lots. Father Boronsky also created the Kosciuszko Building and Loan Association, and through that he was able to subdivide the lots and sell those to parishioners and enable them to build homes through the Kosciuszko Building and Loan. After building the original combination church and school building in 1895, by 1910, the parish began to outgrow that building. It started with maybe 182 families, but by 1912 they hired an architect, a famous ecclesiastical architect, George I. Levat Sr. He was also responsible for designing many of the churches in the Delaware Valley, St. Rita, Acacia, and South Philadelphia as an example. By that time, they were able to construct a church that could fit 1,000 people. So you can see, to see the growth in the church. The other things that we'd like to talk about, we talk about some of the windows. We have magnificent stained glass windows that are attributed to Meyer and Company from Munich, Bavaria. They were probably installed somewhere between the end of the First World War and about 1923 or 1924. We talk about Monsignor Arthur B. Strensky. Maybe we'll talk about him a little bit later, but who was very instrumental in really kind of bringing forth the Polish community. Father Baranski and later on Father Stephen Wyszynski, who oversaw the construction of the main church, they built the church, but I think Monsignor Strensky really established the community. We also talk about the relics that we have. We have a collection of relics on the altar rail that were collected by Father Anthony Sheshi. He was a Croatian priest, also a refugee from the Second World War. And of course we have a relic of St. John Paul II. It's a drop of his blood.
We talk about the fact that we're also part of the Camden County History Alliance, which publishes an annual heritage magazine, and we usually contribute articles to that magazine. And we have advertisements in there also about our tours and the location of the church.
Yeah. I think it's always interesting when you start delving into these histories of these ethnic parishes in particular that there was no Ben Franklin Bridge here in 1891. And the churches that were here that were ministered to Polish immigrants were across the river.
Right.
And to get there, it was done by ferry.
Correct.
And then you had to walk there. And this all on a day off. You were investing a lot of time to get to these churches where you felt at home.
Exactly.
And, it's kind of interesting when you hear about people, I can't drive to Camden for a mass on Sunday. I can't sit there for an hour. And it's like, well, look at what the time and effort that was invested.
Yeah, it was obviously an important part of their lives. And I think it also just kind of it just goes that people had a different view of life. People walked to places. You had to socialize with people on a personal basis.
And I think you mentioned it a little bit. So why did Poles come to Camden in the first place?
They were attracted by the jobs here. There were industries in Camden. At the time when they were coming here in the 1870s to the 1880s, Camden was actually the major population center of Camden County. Most of the population at that time was living in the city. The rest of the Camden County, there were small towns, but it was fairly rural. So they had the jobs here. And there were also just as you know, Michael, there wasn't really a Polish nation at the time. Poland had been divided by Prussia, Russia, and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire in the 18th century. So a lot of people were also just escaping poverty. They were escaping oppression. They maybe didn't want to serve in somebody else's army.
March 19th is the Feast of St. Joseph. Now, we mentioned there's St. Stanislaw in Philadelphia. There's St. Adalbert, St. Wojciech. Very Polish names. Do you have any idea how St. Joseph came to be chosen as the patron?
We have no idea. Some of the ideas have been that they went to Old St. Joseph's when visiting Jesuits were Polish-speaking. Others say, well, every Polish family had at least one Joseph or one Josephine. And then, of course, Joseph Wojtkowiak was the secretary of St. Joseph's Society when they applied to have a parish in South Camden. So we don't know. It's conjecture.
Parish history never recorded the reason why they chose St. Joseph's.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've noticed that there are other Polish parishes across the country, even the one that my family was associated with, that was also St. Joseph. And I've thought about that. I wondered if there had ever been any kind of theological background to that when it came to feeling abandoned as a Polish nation. Did they see St. Joseph as a father figure? Or could it have been something a little bit more mundane, a little as much as Joseph Wojtkowiak, just filling out the paperwork? But yeah, it was something I was always kind of curious about.
It could well have been because St. Joseph was also a worker. And, so many of the Polish people were laborers when they came here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what types of work did they actually do when they did come to? I guess it varied depending on the decade, but...
Yeah, early on, again, there were the industrial jobs that could be filled here. The shipyards that were working along the Delaware River. There were leather works in North Camden. Not that far away, there were ironworks there along the Cooper River. Not that far from the neighborhood that were established. So yeah, those were really the kind of jobs that attracted them.
And also, in the late 19th century, the number of factories in Camden increased by more than 50%. It was an area of big growth, and they needed more workers than they had on hand. So, of course, that encouraged more people to come here.
So if you were arriving from Poland in, around the turn of the last century, the 19th century, could you kind of set the scene for us? What would they have encountered if they just kind of came off the boat, so to speak, and walked into this Camden neighborhood? What would it have sort of looked like?
I guess at the time, the city was kind of transferring from a city that was largely wooden structures. If you think of the Walt Whitman House, that was common, but I think it was now starting to turn into a city that was made of brick. I think they would have found a city that people walked or took a train to places. Electricity was just starting a new thing. We found out that the original church and school didn't have electricity or heat when it was first built. That was added a few years later. It was still largely an industrial city, a city with a lot of bars.
At the time that they came, by 1895, they were building the first church. And when you think about it, in a short period of time, they built 2 churches in the neighborhood, because the first one was in 1895. That's our parish hall today. But when they outgrew that, they installed the new church that we know. Well, we call it the new church, but it was dedicated in 1915. But so in a short period of time, the area just grew. And I think a lot of the area was undeveloped, so they bought lots and built houses around the church.
Yeah.
And then they had jobs there. There was also the Polish Citizens Club, which later became the PACC. That's where people would congregate as well. And then in Kosciuszko Hall, which was a large hall around Kane Avenue, where they would have big celebrations and meetings and everything. It was a neighborhood for people from Poland.
You said they built these 2 churches, and the one we have today, which the new church, quote unquote, and it's a beautiful structure, a magnificent structure we talk about all the time. How did they pay for this?
By themselves. They raised $100,000 to build the church. No outside funds that we know about. It was all the parishioners.
That's pretty incredible when you think about that.
Of course it is.
Yeah, you're not going to build something like St. Joe's today to begin with, but to have, because I can imagine what a working class salary was for an immigrant or unskilled worker, and then to contribute enough to build this structure is pretty incredible. And so you've talked a little bit about the different people you've interviewed, and I guess your own history, long history with the parish, and the delving through the archives. Are there any kind of amusing anecdotes or anything interesting that you've heard over the years?
I'll tell you one interesting story we found out, and it kind of illustrates the maturing of the community. The first Polish-American police officer on the Camden force. He was known as Rudolph Klimes, and the way he became a police officer was he joined the Republican Party. He had previously worked for the election of a Democratic mayor, and there was a promise, which at the time the police department was totally a patronage.
What year was this?
This would have been in 1901.
1901, okay.
Yeah, this has been 1901. He had worked with the Democrats, and there was talk that they would now appoint a Polish police officer. So 1904, he was advised to join the Republicans. And this was the year that Theodore Roosevelt was elected president, but the race for mayor was very close. It was decided by 200 votes.
Wow.
And a lot of that credit went to the people of the 7th Ward, where the Polish people lived, to be able to turn the election to to Charles Ellis, who became mayor for approximately 20 years. And that's how Rudolph Klimes was later appointed a police officer. And he was an interesting character. He had to change his name to join the police force. He was actually Rudolph Klimaszewski,
Okay.
but they made him shorten his name to Klimes so that they could pronounce it. He appears to have been one of the founding families of St. Joseph's. He was also a rather educated man. We kind of think that most of these people that came over here were poor immigrants that may not have been literate. But he had worked in the court system in Warsaw. He was able to speak a number of languages: Russian, German, Latin, Polish, and English. He was fluent in all of them. And he became not only a police officer, but he also became a translator in the Camden court system. So it kind of shows, I think, that kind of maturity where now the community, went from being scattered to the city, kind of coalescing, and now also becoming a political force in the city.
It's interesting, we of course had just been through a national election and people were talking about the swing states. So I guess the 7th Ward was essentially the swing district of the city of Camden. So that's kind of interesting.
I think the other things, though, is just, I think talking about the neighborhood, growing up, it was a place where you could walk down Mount Ephraim Avenue and go to various stores. We had Bonosh's 5 and 10 cent store where everybody did their shopping for sundry items, for Halloween costumes and school supplies and sewing kits and everything.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess part of that question is not necessarily stories that you've heard, but your own stories. I mean, your association with the parish. Like, what are kind of some fond memories, even places that might not even still be there in that neighborhood, but just some favorite childhood memories or growing up?
I think one of the things was the musicals that used to happen with the school kids.
Oh, the musicale and the musicana. Yes, we had them every year in the grammar school. We would have them in the parish hall. Yes, every year. That was a big deal. And then, of course, in the high school, we had the operettas every year.
And I remember the Polish Beneficial Society would also host a Christmas get-together for the children of the parish. Where you got to see Santa Claus and get a gift.
So there was a lot going on.
There was a lot
Always.
going on. Yeah, there was a lot going on. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the high school, and the grammar school was mentioned briefly. So, and it's kind of interesting if you look at the old school/church building. You had the school and the church together, and most of the time you would see when one of these churches would go up, there would be a school, sometimes first. So, what was kind of the role of education in the parish?
Oh, education was big from the beginning. Of course, in the beginning, the parish hall was 4 grades, and it wasn't really expanded until Monsignor Strensky came in. He was a big proponent of education. And each year after the war, he increased the education by a year until it was a full high school. 1949 was the first graduating class.
Yeah, going back to some of the old newspaper reports, part of Monsignor Swell. Let me start with Monsignor Strensky's story regarding education. As a young priest, he was a chaplain at boys' reformatories, and that convinced him of the importance of a Catholic education, for moral reasons and for spiritual reasons. And so education became very important to him. Some of the early accounts talk about him being responsible for increasing parochial school in Polish or Polish parochial schools, going from the 6th grade to increasing it up to the 8th grade. And what Dot was talking about was in the 8th grade, when he started to increase when he started the high school, he started by first really starting a junior high school in 1936, where he added a 9th grade to the grammar school. And then after the war, he began adding another grade every year until he achieved the first graduating class of St. Joseph's High School. The high school was held back into the old building, along with some storefronts that were rented across the street. And then in 1952, he pretty much on his own built St. Joseph's High School on Mount Ephraim Avenue.
My father was in the first ninth grade class that they had. And of course, that was the end of the school here. Then he had to go elsewhere. But
And since his name has come up many times, and he's sort of this larger than life figure in the parish, let's talk a little bit about Monsignor Szychulski. I mean, his name has always, since I've been going to St. Joe's, has been on the lips of every parishioner, and now our hall is Monsignor Szychulski Hall, and there's all sorts of good feelings and history that's associated with the man. So maybe tell us a little bit, since he's so identified with St. Joe's history, let's talk a little bit more about Monsignor Szychulski.
I think he's the reason we're here.
Briefly, he was pastor from 1934 until 1966.
It's a very long tenure.
A very long tenure.
But then he became pastor emeritus. He stayed here until he died in 1980.
So it's a long life, too.
At age 99, yeah. He's just
We thought he was going to make 100.
Yeah. But when I say that, he really formed the community, he really was a leader in many ways, not just in regarding to his pastoralship at St. Joe's. There were things like in 1941, he was appointed to the New Jersey Governor's Goodwill Commission to promote ethnic and racial tolerance. In 1943, he was appointed to the U.S. Labor Relations Board, and in 1950, and I think this was really important to the continuation of the parish, he became the director of the Diocese Office of Displaced Persons Bureau. So he was aiding people that were displaced in Europe, that were displaced during the Second World War, and through that, he was able to bring a new influx of Polish immigrants into the parish. And at a time when even like many of the older established residents were starting to make that move to the suburbs, this brought in a new group of people into the community. He founded St. Joseph Cemetery in Stews Landing in 1936, a cemetery for his parishioners. In 1940, he invited the Little Servant Sisters of the Immaculate Conception to begin what would become St. Mary's Home in Cherry Hill. So he was a visionary. He came here at a time right after, as the Depression was hitting. There were problems in the neighborhood, and I think he helped bring people together through kind of reestablishing all the church societies. His influence just kept going on and on for all those years.
If he wanted something, he went ahead to do everything possible to make it happen.
Yeah, you said that about single-handedly building the high school.
After the school had already been established, he wanted to expand it. And we lived on Decatur Street at the time, which was down the street from the high school. I was probably 4 years old, and he knocked on the door one evening, and he came right in and sat down and said to my parents, "If you can pledge $100 to me today to pay over the next 2 years, your daughter will go to high school for free." And that's how he got the money to continue the high school. So he expanded it from the portion of the building that it was to everything that it became on pledges. Because he knew people didn't have $100 to give him. But they could give him $1 a week. And that's how he built it.
Yeah, I mean, he just always does seem like this one of the people that I've seen it so often in not St. Joe's history, but in history in general. It's like, oh, if you could pick one historical figure to sit down and talk with, he seems like he was very much that. But it's also he's still in the mind of people, like
Yes.
Yeah.
which is interesting.
We all knew him, so it's not someone we heard about in the past. I mean, he was there in our lifetimes.
And I think too, the past few years in particular, priests have kind of had a rough time, and sometimes when you look back at these people that were lions in their community and the part they played and the respect they gained, I think you can reflect on that a little bit as a priest and think. I mean, I don't know for sure, but you can kind of think about that and how did these men pull this off? What was their relationships with their parishioners? And it was. I think there's a lesson in there from the priests of old, people like Monsignor Szychulski, this larger life figure.
He was interviewed and he talked about going to work at a very young age, and it's taught him about. He said, "It taught me about business and about people." And as experiences as a very young curate. He became a priest into what was then, I think, still the Diocese of Newark. He had a territory that covered everything from Hackensack to Millville.
Oh.
Because there were only a few Polish pastors and they had to take care of their parishes. So he was assigned to go out and minister to Polish people that were scattered throughout central and South Jersey. And I just had this memory of him. I always remember him, even in his old age. He had this incredible posture. That he walked with such dignity, and his back was straight. So he had a way of carrying himself. And he wasn't particularly a tall man. But he did have.
He gave the impression of being tall.
But he gave the impression of being tall. He had a presence.
So, Dot, you said that you've been in the choir since you were 9, right? Is that correct?
Well, yes. I came in with Mr. Rikachevsky, who was there for about 50 years. Well, he was there for more than 50 years, really, because I believe Mr. Rikachevsky came in 1940, 1941, and he was there until he died in 1997.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. You have these two names, Strensky and Rikachevsky, that their lives parallel each other in a lot of ways. And from my own history in the choir, but you've heard about it and how well-known the choir was and how professional it was. Can you talk a little bit about the choir and your experiences and what kind of an organization it was and has been in your experience?
Well, my experience was probably a little bit different because I was in the children's choir. So I started in the children's choir when I was about 9, and that continued through 8th grade. But Mr. Rikachevsky was just wonderful with everyone. And at rehearsals, he would play each line separately. Okay, let's hear the altos. Okay, let's hear the tenors, So he would go through each one. And there was never any doubt when we walked into the choir loft what we were doing. It was all automatic. He loved the music. He loved teaching us the music. And we didn't have to think about anything. We automatically knew what we were doing all the time. At least I did. I mean, that was my impression. And then I came back many years later, and of course Mr. Rikachevsky was no longer there, but Grant Walensky had trained with him. So the music was all the same. Of course, there weren't as many members of the choir at that point, and now there are even fewer, but it was a spectacular organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I remember hearing about the Mardi Gras parties they had.
Every year they did the Mardi Gras until the 60s.
Yeah.
My one memory of Mr. Rikachevsky, not so much with the choir, but he was a gentleman who, before Christmas, would come around with the opłatki for everyone. Mm-hmm. He would go door to door, and maybe we should explain what opłatki are.
Well, if people listen to the Christmas episode, they'll know. But go ahead.
But yes, he would come. He would come to everybody's house and
come in and sit down.
Yeah, and just in terms of numbers, so the church was built for a capacity of 1,000, and in its heyday, so how many masses are we talking on a Sunday?
Oh my goodness!
Well, I think we had 2 heydays.
Okay.
I think we had the first heyday from 1890s to about 1915.
Yes.
Or thereabouts, when our church was dedicated. And then the second heyday was in Monsignor Strensky's time. And of course, we can speak more to Monsignor Strensky's time because that was closer to our time. So, but during Monsignor Strensky's time, I'm going to say we had 4 masses on Sunday.
Oh, at the very least, yeah. I remember going sometimes when I had to go to work, a 6:30 mass in the morning. There were multiple masses on the weekdays too. So yeah, a lot of masses were said then. Of course, there were also like 3 or 4 other priests in the parish as well.
We always had a large number of priests, and that's something we don't have anymore.
And there was even an annex.
The annex right? was on Decatur Street where I lived, yes. And I think they built that in the late 40s to accommodate the overflow.
Yeah, so you're talking thousands and thousands of people, essentially, that grew up in this neighborhood.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was such a part of their life, a center of everything from a social standpoint, not just a religious standpoint, but social education.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and now it's, so one of the things that we've come to realize in the merging process so we've established the St. Joseph Apostolate, and you can speak a little bit about that. So I mean, it reflects kind of the people, these thousands of people are no longer living in South Camden necessarily that go to church at St. Joe's, but it's spread sort of across the diocese.
Yeah, there's kind of a diaspora of Polish people from Camden, but they're spreading throughout the diocese, and I think sometimes a lot of people now aren't quite aware of those roots anymore. When you go back and see really where you came from.
When people come to the church for tours and say, my grandparents grew up here, my parents grew up here, it's always a wonderful experience for them, wouldn't you say?
Yes, especially because they may not have been to church,
Right.
For one thing, or the church that they may have been more of a modern church.
Modern churches, yes.
More austere than this one, and when they look and see all this beautiful Baroque architecture, I have learned never to start talking to people right away when they come into the church. I back off a little bit and let them absorb the building. Let them absorb the feeling of the place.
So talk a little bit about that. Why do people come back to St. Joe's? What makes it so special?
It's kind of like coming back to grandmom's house, getting back in touch to where you've really been. I think it's also just because it's such a special place. I always notice that, when I come in, there's a lot of noise, there's activity outside, and you step into St. Joseph's and it's quiet. It's beautiful, but it's also very subtle. I think people like to see that grandeur, and that's missing a lot today. People like to come back for Easter, especially for the traditional Easter basket blessing. And suddenly, you're together again as a community. You come back, you're in contact with people that you may not have seen for the year.
Or 20 years.
Or 20 years, for that matter. There is just... It's really hard to describe, but there is an emotional impact of this church.
Well, for us it's true because it's our home. So for us it's a little bit different. But for people walking in from the outside who have never been there, for them it's a very impactful thing as well, because it is this place of grandeur. It's a magnificent building on its own. And then as you walk around and learn the history of what really happened there, and then when they come across the alleyway to go see the Shopka and the history room and find out even more, there are people who will spend the entire afternoon there who have never been there, because it is that fascinating to them, wouldn't you say, Henry?
Yeah, I think that's one of the nice things about the tours, is that it is a thing that we open up to everybody. We love it when, people who are associated with the parish and haven't been there for a while come back. But we also like it when people who've never been there come to have a look and are really impressed by it. I think the building is impressive. I think the other thing is, though, with the other people of the History Society, they begin to have an interaction with those people. And they begin to kind of get a feel for the place, understand more about it.
And then hopefully they will come back for something, whether they come to Mass or come to another event. But they usually will recommend it to other people as well.
I'm wondering if maybe we could talk a little bit about the neighborhood, because it's been interesting for me learning about the Kościuszko Savings and Loan, and how the church is, of course, magnificent and beautiful on its own. And yet you can't take the church out of the neighborhood. The neighborhood was so much a part of its history. And it's a history that, as much as we've talked about Strensky and kind of these high days of the parish and the thousands living in the neighborhood, there's a more recent history that's a little bit more painful, that people have experienced. And there's some certain challenges with the parish because of that. So just maybe talk a little bit about that, about kind of how the church fits in with the neighborhood, both. I mean, we talked a little bit about the past, but maybe today.
I think there is a ministry about just being there. This is kind of hard to describe, but I think it's just still important that a church is there, especially even maybe now because the neighborhood has changed. I guess you could say it has declined. There's more poverty there. I think it offers at least some stability.
Well, I think the idea of neighborhood has changed because when we were growing up, we walked nearly everywhere in the neighborhood. But now, people who come to St. Joe's come from elsewhere. They drive in, but it's still their neighborhood church rather than something physically close to where they live. So it's not the same experience we had growing up, but it's still there, and people still come back.
So this idea of neighborhood, it almost reflects the idea of our parish becoming an apostolate in a way, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, we're being, we were sent, the people that lived in that parish were sent out. And now so are we, in a way, to try and still make them aware that we're still there as well. So for those who are not familiar with St. Joe's at all, that maybe have never been there listening to the podcast, what would you say is something you would like them to know maybe about St. Joe's or its history in particular?
I think the first thing we should let them know is that St. Joe's is on the National and State Register of Historic Places, both for their architectural and for the cultural reasons. I'd like to let them know that we have Mass every Sunday at 10 o'clock, and they're welcome to come.
So we have a szopka. It's something unique. It's a mechanical nativity. It's a Polish tradition. And as far as we know, it's the only one in this country.
Yeah, and also, you can spend time with about 90 saints, still in some way physically present. Because there, we have approximately that number of first-class relics on the altar rail. You come in and kind of talk about it. I always remember Father Pavel Kriskevich when he was pastor here, and he said this about churches in general, that even if the people are gone, the prayers still remain. When I go and open up the church for a tour, I do get that kind of feeling that the prayers of all those people are still here.
Well, I think our history also demonstrates that we were a community of people who were able to come together and create something magnificent based on their faith and self-reliance.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. It is. There's something magical about the place. I mean, I've never heard that before about Father Pavel said that about the prayers still remaining.
Yeah, the prayers still remain. It's there, and whenever I go into the city, I am always sad because I see parts of it that are gone. The more and more, we're losing things. We just lost the monastery of the Perpetual Rosary where the Dominican sisters are. I'm going to be writing about that for the next issue of the History Alliance magazine. As you lose those things, part of you seems to be gone too. And this is the part that has stayed all these years. And yes, I think the prayers still remain there.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that there are two heydays of St. Joe's. I'd like to think that the third heyday is coming. And I think you can look at the history of, well, really any area in this country and see that. I mean, we've talked about the city of Camden. When these Poles first came there, it was farmland, essentially. And it expanded, and it had this industrial surge and this kind of heyday, and then it had these problems and this decline. And, neighborhoods change. The only real, I think, constant is change. That's a cliche to some extent. But I think there is a reason for hope always. But I think there is for St. Joe's. And so in that spirit, I mean, what do you kind of hope for St. Joe's in the future? What are your kind of wishes for it?
Well, we'd like to continue to share our Polish traditions into the future with anyone who's willing to share. If they want to learn about these traditions, they're welcome to share them with us.
Yeah, I think it's a place where people can still come back to or visit, because it is a special place. I don't want to make it into a museum. It still needs to be an active and vibrant church where people can come and celebrate the Eucharist. It's also a place with history, and that's something that should be shared and remembered, and to try and bring more people in, especially for special occasions. We host the Juan 23 group a few times a year for retreats there. And I think we'd like to see more of that. Other cultures coming in and learning about us.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the spirit of this program too. That we have, St. John Paul II was a Polish priest who was given to the church in this great way, and he gave all these saints to the church. So there is, yes, we want to celebrate our own unique traditions, but we also want to do that same thing, to share it with so many people. And I think it's important to note that we do have these different activities within the cathedral parish, like you said, the one the 23rd Vintage retreat group that does use the old rectory and the hall. But St. Joe's, even though it was sort of established as a Polish personal parish, you can look at the rolls and see different kinds of surnames on there, which I think is interesting, and it's important to note. And I mean, there's people who come to our church of different backgrounds that aren't there's no drop of Polish blood in them whatsoever. And there was actually someone who just said this to me recently, how they feel so much more at home in our parish with our our group, and it just does it sort of radiates that sense. I think I've noticed. I always noticed it because I myself am a transplant, really. Even though I'm Polish, this was not where my family really came, and I felt that sense immediately and always have. And so my last question I have is kind of similar to this. How do you feel it's still relevant to the rest of the diocese in the region?
Well, we are, first of all, the only last remaining Polish church in the diocese. We still have that identity. And most parishes really are not neighborhood parishes anymore. Parishes are more fluid than they were. It used to be, if you lived here, this is where you went, that was the rule. People are more fluid now.
I think we're unique. I mean, that may not be something to everyone, but it may be something to some people.
This is really a hard question because, we really struggle with survival. And we'd like to step beyond survival.
If there was someone who kind of came from Poland, some of the displaced people that Father Szychulski helped, what was that community engagement like with people who might be struggling or starting out?
I think you found a place that people with that similar experience, that you could kind of come together. From my experience growing up in that community that was post-Second World War, the Polish immigrants that came over, they were a very stoical kind of group. I mean, they've seen things, all of them saw things that you should never have to see. And I guess in some ways, St. Joe's became that kind of refuge. It became a place for them to gather together, just for fellowship.
Well, Dot and Henry, thank you so very much for this great walk through St. Joe's history. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Due to the extended nature of our interview, and since St. Joseph was very much at the center of it, we decided to forgo our usual Polish Saint of the Month segment for this episode. However, I don't want to leave you without some spiritual food to chew on. As we learned from Dot and Henry, the origin of St. Joseph's patronage of our apostolate is unknown. Yet, I feel that there is a lot to learn from his life as it relates to our community's origins, history, and future. Joseph's mention in Scripture is sparse, and no actual words are attached to give him voice. He exists largely in the background, his past shrouded in legend, even much of his life as a father, hidden. Yet, what we do see in the moments when he was called to his purpose, usually by an angel in a dream, is a man of intense and instant action. We see his courage in taking Mary as his wife, despite the cultural shame and scandal it would bring. We see him as the protector, seeing to the safeguarding of his family as they become refugees in a foreign land. We see his very human anxiety in searching for Jesus before the finding in the temple. In our current time, when fear often keeps us from acting for good or for a greater purpose, how often do we answer with Joseph's direct action? Broken homes seek providers. The immigrant seeks refuge. Our Polish ancestors were the same refugee immigrant laborers as Joseph, working hard, often in the background, providing for their families and communities, yet in genetic possession of a remarkable lineage and history. Joseph, directly descended from King David, yet working as a humble carpenter, remains an almost silent figure, watching over his family in the background and nurturing through example the Savior of the world. How do we set an example to our families, communities, and children? Do we pass down the traditions and heritage of our ancestors? Do we glorify God in our work and our home? St. Joseph is a silent guide, ever watchful and ever nurturing. Perhaps in him you can see your own parent, grandparent, or even a priest like Monsignor Strensky, a spiritual father in his own right. What do we do to honor our now silent fathers who look to us from beyond the generations, wondering how we take the legacy of their struggles going forward? The Latin phrase, ite ad Joseph, go to Joseph, is an ancient saying, urging us to seek him out in prayer and petition in times of trouble, but also for comfort and strength as a spiritual model to be emulated. The next time you visit us and see his statue displayed so prominently in the center of our high altar, remember not just his silent life, but the silent lives of all those who walked here before you. And, as we observed earlier, hear their prayers that still remain in walls, pews, windows, plaster, and stone. We sincerely hope that you have enjoyed this walk through the past, present, and future of our beloved parish and apostolate. We also hope that you have a very blessed St. Joseph's Day. And as always, don't forget to follow our social media pages. And if you do listen to us on Spotify or Apple, please leave us a review. This greatly helps our visibility. And until next time, salte some pierogi and go sit with the saint. Thank you, dziękujemy, and do usłyszenia.